Okay, we're live. Good evening, everyone, and welcome. Now, if you go down to your council today and look behind the scenes, you'll be in for a big surprise. Now, most of us receive glossy literature from our local councils telling us how marvellous they are, but the truth is very different. On 3 occasions, I've witnessed questionable interaction between local councils, housing developers and their PR companies. Now, these PR companies are employed to manipulate public opinion. This evening, our guest is Mark Windows, who has proof that local councils are now employing change agents as an integral part of manipulating public opinion. Now, Mark, what on earth is going on at our local councils?
Well, there's basically something going on which is about taking away public participation. So public participation is being removed from the equation. How do you do that? Well, what you need to do is you need to make it look as though the public are participating when the decisions have already been made. And that's what's been happening in councils for the last 10 years, especially in the last 5 years. Now, this consultation process you're talking about is very interesting because they get PR companies involved to actually test the ground for them. In other words, they look for the sort of people who they're going to have as, well, let's call them useful idiots. And then they use these people to steer the majority of the public in the area. We can get into how that's done, but that's broadly what the template is. And also in your introduction, you mentioned something about, you know, the way that councils communicate. Now they have these newspapers that come out, and these newspapers are now not just your local council propaganda rag, but they're also being put out by sort of private interests to steer public opinion. And they're also being used as this sort of council front. Yeah.
Mm. Oh, yes, yes. And also we have to pay for that propaganda. And I've noticed that, I mean, years ago, we never used to get any rubbish from the council like that. And it costs quite a bit of money to do. But what I've actually noticed, I've witnessed this, as I've said 3 times, is liaison between building developers, local councillors. And if you look into, you can actually look at your local councillors and see what their outside interests are. And a lot of them are, inverted commas, PR consultants. What's that? You know, PR consultants. And they're absolutely hand in glove. I mean, the last planning meeting I went to, which was open to the public, it was like, well, I've often said this, like the Muppet Show without the humour. And at the end of the proceedings in the lobby, there were councillors patting the backs of building developers and presumably clearing off down to the pub together. It's all, oh yeah, jolly good, well, we got that one through, didn't we? Oh, and all this sort of stuff. And it's not democratic at all. And
well, I think what you're talking about is it's become more brazen. It's become so brazen that they're used to it and it's absolutely normal. So they don't see any problem with that as far as their public image goes. 100 councillors in London were known to have direct links with property developers. That means they're getting financial remuneration for being in partnership or being employed by property developers. Now, the thing is that this deregulation that's gone on with the building in London, with the loss of 400,000 council homes, and Savills bringing in this thing called Complete Streets, and also Lord Adonis was part of this as well. It was about the destruction of all the social housing. Now, that's very interesting. So how can you do that with no public consultation? Well, you do it with legislation, and you do it with what we talk about in our talks, the Real Citizens Assembly, with these global action plan initiatives that are implemented at a local level. So in other words, you don't really have any input into what your local council is doing. Now, we can go into what the history of all that's about, which is very interesting, because traditionally you would have liabilities to your council and the council would have liabilities to you. I did an article which describes all this, and it's actually called Are You a Pauper? And it goes into where actual liabilities are with the council and what council's liabilities are to us, going back to the poor laws of the 1600s. And that is actually where council tax comes from. So when we start looking at this, we're looking at councils now becoming more corporate, in fact, being really corporations, and they think their public liability has been taken away, and their public liability has not been taken away, but they are becoming removed from public scrutiny and public availability. I think that's the point.
Well, yes, and what is actually what they're actually doing? They're kind of mind manipulators now. That you've got these change agents in there, as you quite rightly said. But another thing they're doing is ethnic cleansing of areas in London and moving people to the suburbs. And this is why they're building around the home counties. So because they're ethnically cleansing London. I mean, I think you've actually got personal experience of this, haven't you, Mark?
Very much so. I've been to some of these planning meetings because it's all part of our research for Windows on the World. And I've attended several of them, one with Piers Corbyn, which was in South London, which is the Elephant and Castle regeneration. The Elephant and Castle is a place in South London which spreads from Old Kent Road to the Peckham area. And that's going to be one large shopping mall, as is the rest of London. So we went to the planning meetings, and they use a thing called Delphi technique, which was developed by the Rand Corporation in the 1950s. And it's a way of gaining what they call group consensus. In other words, if you have a group of people and you have an intended outcome, you don't want to waste time and money by actually engaging them. From a corporate point of view, what you do is you steer the group into an intended outcome using change agents or facilitators. All these meetings have facilitators and co-facilitators. The one I'm talking about was actually a rather large public meeting. It was all about the regeneration of a whole area. So they had about 100 and odd people there, all split into tables of 10. Everything in this country is run using Delphi technique, including these citizens' assemblies. So citizens' assemblies, council meetings, your protest groups like Extinction Rebellion, all run on exactly the same template. So it's kind of clever in a way. And the public are there going, oh, they're a protest group. No, they're not. They're all run by the same thing. There's a great quote that sums all this up. And it's that the globalists need the anti-globalists to steer their policies. The anti-globalists have nothing to do. That's the protesters. So they're given their protests by the globalists. They're given their banners. They're given the structure and the hierarchy of the system which they go into, which is a so-called protest group. And this is how it's run. It's called the New Democracy. And it came out of papers going from the Club of Rome onwards from the late 70s. Now we have Demos, which is a public policy think tank, which actually says the new democracy will work with a combination of citizens groups taking direct action and open government infiltration. And that's coming from a public policy think tank. So they're not hiding any of this. There's no big conspiracy or conspiracy theory behind it. It's just a system of corporate global governance, which is implemented locally.
Well, I've mentioned this before, but I'll be very brief on it. And it can go back to the 1980s when I first noticed this. There was a project, I mentioned this last time, but you know, I'll be very brief. In the Midlands, where there was an area of outstanding natural beauty, and they wanted for years to build a housing estate on there, and there was massive protests. There's a protest group, there was nature conservation groups, you name it, there was. So it was sort of cut and dry that you could never build on this area. So the local council and the developer, they obviously wanted to build on there. So what happened one day was a PR group came along to help, inverted commas, the local community. And they went to the community hall with little badges, you know, Sarah, Tony, Mark, you know, very, very nice. And I walked in there. Who are you? I'm Chris. Spelled K-R-I-Z. I always remember that, Chris.
Yes.
Hello, go over there. It's so full. She was wondering whether their leg was going to fall off any minute. You know, oh, hello, and all this. We're here to help you. You know, we don't want these. And what happened is the developer got the Office Junior to draw up plans for, I think it was a cement factory and developments and all kinds of things like that. And it was absolutely abysmal what they planned. They wanted to put an industrial area, was it a cement processing thing, which would be going 24 hours a day, and this nice PR group, they were there to protest and stop this happening. You know, we're helping you, and this is absolutely disgusting. And what happened is the developer gave some money to the local protest groups to help them, of course. And this PR firm went to have a meeting, inverted commas, with the local council to stop this industrial development. And at the last moment, we've made a breakthrough. They're not going to put an industrial development there. We're going to have much needed housing. And people
it's
went
almost
along
like
with
that's
it.
what happens in a film, right? You're creating a story. So what you do is you string people along, and that's like called a last act reversal in a film. So the last act of the film, you've got everybody is thinking, we've won, we've won, we've won. Then there's something that happens that gets in the way. And then sometimes there's another plot twist at the end. But in this case, there's no plot twist because we know what was going to happen. However, that's a side issue. But it's a good way of comparing it, because what we're looking at here is something that's not real, that's a created and constructed outcome. So basically, it may as well be a movie because the script's already been written. Now, what you're talking about is the controlling of the narrative of public opinion. And that happens through these people who come in and they work in the public and private sector. And we call them change agents. They're trained in basically the principles of this new form of governance, which is all about the removal of democracy, but with the appearance of democracy. So what you've got is people who are steering the public into the intended outcome. So if you've got a local council group and it's sort of you have a local action group, they call it a local action group. Anything with local action group means that the council have taken it over. Therefore, you have to form your own, which is why we are recommending people form their own real citizens' assembly. Call it people's assembly rather than citizens. But the point is that the citizens' assemblies are run on the same principle. You're being steered into an outcome. And it's the same with local protest groups. We know this because we've been involved with them. We've seen exactly what you're talking about. And it's not the exception, it's the norm. That's the way democracy works in Britain today, or so-called democracy. It works with an outcome which has already been determined. You're just being steered into it and you have no choice. Well, you've got one choice, no choice.
Well, that's right. That's right. I mean, I've noticed this, you know, what I was saying about what happened in the East Midlands happened on another project I'm working on. And what happened is this PR group, this was in the 1990s, was so good that there was a mass protest against this industrial area being, and this was an actual industrial area which was being built in another area. The PR group was so good that they turned the protesters into a minority group, and all the residents turned against them. So they kind of were against the industrial area first of all. And I'm not talking about the one in the Midlands. I'm talking about the one somewhere else in the country. And it was just flipping around all the time. And it's very, very clever what they do. And what's happened locally, a developer has employed a PR company, and they're saying now that there was a mass protest in 2013 against 64 houses being built. There's going to be 320 houses built. And is there a mass protest? No. There's only 4 people, including myself, that's against it. And there are 70 people allegedly for it.
Yeah, well, I think you went through that documentation with me when it arrived on your doorstep. Yeah. So what you've got here is you have a consultation. A local consultation is run by a PR company. That PR company then identifies the people who are going to be for what they want, and the whole thing's skewed, and basically they're controlling the narrative. So there's no need for a consultation because they're controlling the consultation. So the idea of this is that the council then remove even more liability. But to get back to what's happening, that's going on everywhere. We did a talk in Colchester a couple of weeks ago, and there's a new development called Marks Tay that's being built there. And that's going to have 45,000 houses. So that's a new city being built. Now,
Yeah.
this is amazing because it goes into the UN Agenda 2030 plans that they want. Well, they wanted everybody in cities by 2050. Now, the public have voted to be pushed into the smart city gulags by 2030. And this is all on the back of this organization called Extinction Rebellion, who are basically a globalist lobbying group for global governance. And so the public have now been steered into a citizens' assemblies on the back of this so-called protest group. Citizens' assemblies are the end of all democracy. They are an absolutely totalitarian idea, and they have nothing to do with public input. And I know the way this is run. I've been on the websites that are rolling it out. And yes, we're talking about the same template over and over again, but it's an interesting template. And it's a template that has to be decoded. Otherwise, you will be completely naive to it. Now, the thing is that there's very little public engagement in this country from the public. They tend to think that they're kind of mollycoddled into a situation where the state somehow is in support of them. Well, I'm here to tell you that it's not. We don't have a governance system in this country the way that people think we do. Many people listening to this will probably know that. However, the point is that most of the public have no idea how anything runs in this country unless they go up against it or start to stand up for something, or they're on the receiving end of something that happens. And that is the problem. The thing is in this country is that the public, as long as they've got widescreen TV, big screen TVs on their walls, and they have a certain standard of living, they won't actually realize what's going on. And that's a huge problem because it means that there's very little local engagement into what's actually happening.
That's right. That's right.
You know, there's no engagement within people locally who actually form their own real groups and do things. I know people who do, and they've had remarkable outcomes. Now, the thing is with this system that's been put in place, it's very easy to actually take over because it only works in one way. Once it's decoded, that's it. You've had it.
Yes, that's right. Well, there's an old saying, isn't there? And that is, keep your friends close, keep your enemies closer. So we've got to understand the enemy first, and then find a way around them and fight them. Actually, fight fire without fire. Do similar to what they do, because this idea that we live in a democracy is a joke. It really is a joke. We don't live in a democracy. People can't seem to get that into their thick skulls. No, we don't. And this idea of an outcome at the end, this is with everything. I mean, for example, you tune into the propaganda, watch the government propaganda program, i.e. the BBC. I haven't got a television, and they'll say, what are you doing to combat global warming? So they're assuming that global warming is here, but in fact it's the opposite way around.
The whole global warming issue is a new form of benefice. The Roman Church did this in the 1300s. They brought in a papal bull called Unum Sanctum, which said that there was no salvation outside of the Roman Church and that every human creature would be subject to the Roman pontiff. Now, the only way that you could get to heaven was to buy indulgences and get benefits from the church, because the priest class were in the way between you and God. And this is a new form of religion. So in other words, the climate change religion and the use of carbon taxation is the new benefice, and people want a virtue signal and show how green they are. This is a new form of religion which is based on a system of benefice. And I did a show a couple of weeks, I think it was last week. We put it out on Wednesday, and it's called The Man Who Saw the Future.
Oh,
everything
brilliant.
Everything that's being actually implemented now is as a result of what happened in the late 80s. And that system and form of governance was talked about in a document called Our Common Future. How many people know this? Probably, 1 in 1,000 might have even heard of it. Now, the thing is that all this stuff is public, and the way that this system of governance was introduced was, to quote a banker called David Lang from Montreal, he said, "We do not have time to roll this out as a democratic process. It's going to take too long. The cannon fodder won't understand what we're doing. So we need to give them this in a very simple way. It needs to be delivered in a way that they can understand. So they came up with this term called sustainable development, and that went into every council by the year 2000. And everything that's happened since then has been as a result of what's in that document and documents that followed, and things that came out of the Rio summit of 1992. We talk about this in the bigger picture, which is the Citizens' Assembly, the real Citizens' Assembly, and people are blown off their seats if they haven't heard about it before. However, a lot of people, like we had in Hereford, came along and they broadly understood what was going on. And there's one chap there who's a real researcher into ancient history and civilization. So I was really glad to meet, because I'd read some of his work before. And he said, you're totally on the button with this. He said, it's absolutely fascinating, but there's not enough people who can think in this way. And that's absolutely true. And there's nothing special about what we're doing. It's just that we have looked at what's actually written down and then applied it to what's going on. Now, I've got notes here, which I've made about 18 months ago, and all this stuff hit London with the Housing and Planning Act, the London Land Commission identifying land and properties in Greater London for selling off, why all authorities had not sold off or disposed of surplus land, that this was like an inventory. So there was going to be, councils must dispose of surplus land and property in the Housing Planning Act. The Secretary of State can arrange and dispose of freehold or any leasehold land. Now, what we're talking about here is a loss of property rights, and property rights are paramount, and property rights go back to how we interact with councils. If we don't have property rights, the way we interact with councils is going to be profoundly changed, because the balance of power will have tipped completely to them. In the Middle Ages and under the poor laws of the 1600s, if you were found to be vagrant in a county or borough, you would be taken back to the borough where you had a certificate of settlement put into front of the certificate of settlement was like the birth certificate, your national insurance number, and your passport rolled into one. So you had to carry that around with you. If you were found to be vagrant or in breach of the law, you could be brought in front of the local magistrate. They would then decide what to do with you. You could then be put into the workhouse, and you would have a P on your arm for pauper. And that P on the arm for pauper was transferred to your passport. If you look at what type of passport you've got, it says P for pauper. Now, people are going, this sounds very esoteric. Not really. We're dealing with local authorities. So, in other words, the balance of power has completely changed. So now what we have is a system which does not take any notice of law. We live in a system which is lawless. And that has profound effects on the way we actually deal with councils. Several years ago, I won a court case against Waltham Forest Council, and they tried every dirty trick in the book. They lied, they undermined my evidence, and I still won in court. However, now it's going to be extremely difficult to get these people into court, because public liability is being removed. These people are removing themselves from public liability. That's a huge problem. So anyone who's paying their wages, anyone who pays council tax should be aware of this, that their input and their voice is no longer needed and it's no longer heard.
Wow. That's incredible. But I mean, what's happening now is really history repeating itself, because what people don't realize is that when, for example, they were injecting people against, was it cowpox? I think it was. Please correct me if I'm wrong. But this was in the 1790s, and it was compulsory to have that done. And if you did not get vaccinated, you were actually put on a ship to Australia. So the first, in inverted commas, convicts to Australia weren't convicts, they were people that refused to be vaccinated. That's what people don't realise.
Once we start looking at this stuff, it starts to get very interesting, and I'd like to cover more of that in the weeks to come, Chris, because I have so much information I don't have time to put out on the shows, that these sort of general kind of interviews, conversations are really important. And the ones I've been doing recently, I've been able to bring so much of this information out, because there's so many aspects of it. I've got a list of articles here that are really, we could go into the whole of the content of some of these articles and how the interactions with the councils work, because there's people who are still trying things that I know don't work, and there's things that will work. But
you're right.
there's people who are trying things which is, it's almost like a form of disinformation, because if you're trying something that's completely wrong, it's never going to work. And most of the things that are wrong, I have tried and I know they don't work. So yes, there are ways of bringing these people back into accountability, but because of the corporate system and the way it's run, it's become much more difficult. And councils are actually forming these mega regions now. Look at your local council, and you may find it's partnered with up to 2 or 3 other councils. Now, this is a huge problem. For instance, I used to live in a borough called Waltham Forest, Walthamstow, in northeast London. Now, the town hall was where you could serve documentation. They then started to deregulate that and have all the different departments in these different buildings all over the borough. Now what's happened is, guess what? They've sold the town hall off for, guess what? Flats. The town hall will be 500 flats. Several years before I left. Yeah. That what they did is they... Really?
Sorry. Yep, that's what they plan to do. They're going to, it's a lovely building. It's a beautiful building. It was built not that long ago, really, about, off the top of my head, about 20 years ago. Purpose-made building. They're going to sell it off for flats and move to another building.
Yes, they'd already sold off the magistrates' court, so that meant when you went for your council tax to challenge anything, you'd have to go to Bow. Now they've moved it again, apparently. So this makes it even more inconvenient to deal with them. So what we're seeing here is a slow removal of public participation until everything has to be done online. And that means that you're never going to be able to get anywhere with holding these people to account.
Well, that's right. I'll tell you another thing that local councils are doing. They're starting their own companies. And there's my local council started its own property company, a letting business.
Yeah.
So, and guess who's the director of these companies? Local councillors. And one slipped his mind. He forgot to put it down on his list of outside interests. But let's face it, if you're on the fiddle, does it really matter? You know, get away with it.
The thing is, Chris, what you're talking about here is nothing unusual. I mean, this is the norm. It's not the exception. So we're not talking really about corruption anymore. We're talking about the norm. So corruption in the old-fashioned sense is now the norm. Well, so they will say that they're not doing anything wrong. For instance, the Haringey development vehicle, which sold off half of Haringey's infrastructure, or gave the management of Haringey's infrastructure to a company called Lend-Lease, which is an Australian multinational, who became the council's partners. Now, Claire Kober had to resign over that. She was the leader of the council. And when it actually came down to trying to explain what would happen, she said it was because some of the councillors were sexist and they didn't like her because she was a woman. No, they didn't like her because she was in the pockets of property developers and this infrastructure company. Now, the thing is that what we have to remember is that these people who are mentored and trained into any form of government office are now trained in a certain way. And that's incredibly important. They are change agents. They're very belligerent and they will lie through their back teeth. These people are inherently dishonest, and they've been made more dishonest by the programming that they receive. They use psychological subversion against the public. They're trained in psychology, basic psychology, and really they're not very intelligent. In fact, they're very unintelligent. Otherwise, they wouldn't be doing these jobs. They're paid a huge amount of your council tax money for doing it, and they're working against your interest. These are just facts I'm giving you, really. There's no conspiracy theories going on here. I'm talking about all the research I've done. I've been up against councils, and I've won court cases against councils. I've had them on, basically, I've had these people on the ropes, and they will still be lying in court when you've actually won the case. They'll still carry on lying as though it's normal, and judges don't like that. So if you can get them into court, that's a great thing. But the way things are at the moment, what we've got is this rapid takeover of all infrastructure. So a corporate infrastructure has been put in, and all of your recourse is actually being taken away. That's what I think. I keep reiterating that, but I think it's a very strong point that people need to realise.
Well, that's right. That's right. And what I've actually found with councils, for example, these councillors, they use what's the word now? Neuro-linguistic programming. I spoke to a councillor and I said, well, look, this development's not good, blah, 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 blah. And he had this woman who was kind of nurturing him. And she said, but there's loads of greenery around, what are you worrying about? It's only a small percentage of greenery. You know, the woods will still be there, and it's all sort of smoothed over and it's all smart. And another thing they work on is snobbery, because I noticed this PR company had these there, whether they're true letters or fake ones, I don't know. Which, you know, oh, these are going to be executive homes that are going to be built, and I'm very pleased about this. You know, it's going to raise the standards of the area. But what they don't realise is these executive homes will be bought up, allegedly, possibly, by the council's property company, and umpteen families will be moved in there. So they'll probably have the neighbours from hell living next door. So
this
you
is
know,
another thing that's quite
interesting.
Another thing quite interesting, because what they're doing when they're moving people out of London is they're moving them into often kind of rural areas and small towns where they're not fitting in. So this is another part of social engineering. In other words, they're creating conflict so they can bring in the resolution. What's the resolution going to be? Well, a resolution is going to be more draconian surveillance and more power to guess who through the local council.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. And of course, you create a crime situation. So people say, well, we feel better with security cameras around, and we feel better with this and that. For example, a few years ago, I got speaking to a person, and I've heard this from different angles, who lives in a beautiful little village in the West Country.
Yeah. And
I've heard this from several people, so it's not just one. And they used to leave their cars unlocked. And went in one day, he thought, that's strange, look round, and there's a pair of legs, the door open of his car, and a pair of legs dangling from outside, and there's someone trying to nick his radio. And he caught this chap, and remember, this was down in the West Country, and this chap had an accent from the Midlands, not the Midlands, Northumbria. And he found out from the police that what Toe Rag Tony Blair was doing is to make it look as if the crime rate was being lowered, was moving all the problem families out of the inner cities and scattering them into little villages around the West Country.
Yeah, that happened a long time ago. I mean, what happened was I had a flat in Walthamstow, and they couldn't build on the land at the back, and someone sold their garden. They had this very large garden, which meant that they could build on it. And so they built these houses there, and it was East Thames housing. And what they do is they have a quota of these people they have to take. So we had a family at the back, and I mean, they made a hole in my fence, which was about 4 foot square, to get in, and all this sort of stuff. And it was really funny. And they were, well, it wasn't funny at the time, but in retrospect it is. And they were breaking into sheds and smashing windows and just going completely wild, you know. And what happened was there was a meeting with the council in one of the people's houses, and the change agent from the council said, well, we haven't had any more complaints and all this sort of thing. So they were trying to control the narrative back then. But what we're talking about is something now that's on an industrial level. It's no longer just moving a few people into the area who are going to be a problem. It's actually an engineering process, which is very refined. It's not very clever, but it's very refined in the way they do it. So it's a hard template for the public to see, because on the surface you can't see it. It's like anything else. It's like any system of governance. You can't see it. You have to look at how it's being implemented and then go back through the policy and what allowed it to happen and what politicians have been saying or not saying. For instance, in 2010, David Cameron announced the big society, and there was a company called Unlimited, UN Limited. They're not a UN direct company, but they're implementing policies which are of the UN, ironically, but they're called Unlimited. They're in every country in the world. They're in everywhere you can imagine. And basically what they're doing is they're controlling the narrative of public opinion with change agents, people they've trained. Guess what they do? They train future leaders. That's the whole point of this system. They train leaders to be within the system. So in other words, but they're not being trained for a job. They're trained to be part of a system of governance, and it's not the same thing. So in other words, if you years ago would go to someone in the council and you would say, oh yes, you're the local housing officer. Well, that sort of thing doesn't exist anymore. The title may exist, but function of the person is totally different. In other words, you're not relating to them as the job title that they're meant to be. They have an agenda that they're there to push through. So you're just going to get in the way. And that's the way they see it. We've covered this in the talks. This happened up in Waltham Forest. I watched it very carefully up there because I knew all about the implementation of Agenda 21, which is where it came from, and Agenda 2030, which is the implement of it now, basically through the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, which, of course, Greta Thunberg has been used to push. And the whole thing is just a system. It's people are fragmented in the way they're thinking about this. We're talking about the implementation of one system. That's all it is. In 2010, when the big society came in, Unlimited said in Parliament, the result of the cuts will be one of anger, the degree of which is yet to be realized. The idea of the big society is to galvanize that energy before it takes hold. What does that say to you? That means controlling the narrative of public opinion. The government knew that there was possibilities, a great possibility that there would be huge civil unrest and uprisings against what they're doing, especially with housing and the way society is being re-engineered. So what do? Think about it. You can't have that. You have to think of the common good, which means the good of everybody. They've all got to go home to their flat screen TVs and think everything's okay at the end of it. So you cannot have this kind of form of public panic. What happened in France would never happen in the UK, because people here have not got the necessary persistence and they don't know about the necessary hardship. I'm not talking about poverty. Loads of people are in poverty, but there's a slight safety net that's still there for a lot of people. That's being taken away, and it's been taken away over the past 5 years. And what they're doing is trying to control the narrative by pushing these people outwards and splitting them up so they can't get together and revolt. And that was what the whole thing was about with the big society, to start forming these organizations like community organizers, Unlimited, Locality, Intentionality, umbrella groups like Power to Change, lottery funded, and you've got even like the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development funding a lot of this stuff, European Bank funding it. You've got the World Bank funding it. The World Bank is an environmental bank now. This whole thing is one big template, and it's part of what your local council is doing. Yeah.
Yes, I agree. I mean, I think that it would be too much for this program, but what would be nice to cover in a future program, possibly the next one, is what are we going to do positively to push, to kind of kick back at this, understanding the British sort of, shall we say, psychology or the psyche, because I know I've to this before. How comes in France, France almost brought to its knees by yellow vests, and in this country, now, I mean, I don't want to see violence on the street, no, and I don't like to see cars being overturned and firebombs and things like that. But
there's no real need for any of that, and in fact, that's a distraction, because that's got nothing to do with the protest. Now, what happened in France was the same as happens in all protests. They've brought in agent provocateurs to discredit the group.
Precisely.
The problem they've got in France is that the group is very large. So you can only bring in a certain amount of infiltrators. And I think that's the problem they've got in France. So the infiltrators are very obvious. They're these hooded people in black clothes, the same as you have here. They're called Black Bloc or Antifa now, or they used to be called anarchists. Now, basically, it's all part of the same thing. They're agents of the state who go in there to disrupt, and often they're paid. Some of these people are paid to do it. Some of them are just useful idiots who go along because they want to cause trouble. And the police use and steer these people, and undercover police are leading it. So what happens in this country, say you had the People's Assembly, remember that? Well, those people were bussed in and out. They were given their placards. They were given their signs to protest. They were told what to protest about the NHS today, protest about government cuts tomorrow. The government gave them their placards. The government gave them their protest. The government put them onto coaches. The government brought them to London. The government gave them their policing. The government gave them their day out. The government gave them their people to watch from the unions and people who made their worthy speeches. They got on their coaches. They got the banners taken off them, all recycled, and then they got taken home again. That's how protest works in this country. There is no protest.
Well,
everything is run by the state. And if anything is not run by the state, it will be closed down, which is why I say form unaffiliated groups with no name, which you could loosely call the Real People's Assembly. The Real People's Assembly has no leaders. It can be a banner. What's going to happen is if it takes off, these agents of the state, provocateurs, are going to start using that to discredit it. It's going to be attached to all the usual memes, which are the half a dozen negative attachments that are used against individuals. Well, there'll be far-right extremists before you know it. But we all know what. Now, the great thing about this is far-right supremacists and all the rest of it just means people who may want Brexit. We know that this is the narrative. This is the narrative that came out of MI5 when Mark Rowley resigned from MI5. He said the new threat is from the growing far right. There was no growing far right. They created it. They put it in the newspapers. The culmination of that was brilliant when you had Britain First on the Metro, which was two rather tubby, baldy men with their Britain First T-shirts on, with binoculars looking over the white cliffs of Dover. When asked what they were doing, they said, we're looking out for illegal immigrants. Said, well, oh, who do you represent? Britain First. And they said, yes, we represent Britain First. And so they said, well, what are you going to do when you find illegal immigrants? They said, well, we're going to tell the Coast Guard, which is what every person should do, right? If you see a boatload of illegal immigrants, what do you do? Call the Coast Guard or the police, right? So in other words, they were doing what everybody should do. So the story was so absurd. It showed up the security services narrative for what it is, cartoon pantomime. Because I don't know why they call these people the intelligence services, because the British intelligence services are absolutely comedically stupid, you know.
Well, that's right. That's right. I mean, they're really like robots. I find that I think a lot of these people like that you find that are trolls and that. Now, all right, you always got your nutters. There's always the loonies. But I've noticed that the government type trolls, we won't know for sure, but you think they are. They'll always take things to the extreme. Like I was talking about what was happening in France on another program and comparing it. Why is it the British are so placid? And I got a troll saying, oh, so you want people, petrol bombs and cars being overtowed?
Yes, well, what they do is, as Meatloaf said, you took the words right out of my mouth before I even thought of it, basically. I mean, the point is that this is what they do. They say, I suppose this and I suppose that. We'll never suppose anything for a start, you know. I mean, this is the great thing. I suppose you vote for Trump, you know. I suppose you don't like immigrants. I suppose this, I suppose that. Well, no, never suppose anything, you know. I thought that was very funny. That and logical fallacies are what are used, you know. Negative attachments and logical fallacies are used all day long because that's all the intelligence services can think of, because they're not very intelligent. I mean, the thing is with psychological warfare, it has to be in some way kind of sophisticated, but this is so unsophisticated, it's just funny, you know.
Well, that's right.
But then again,
yeah. It's like when you're at school, you know, you're a sissy and all that. But, you know, what you're saying about earlier about sort of opposition, as Lenin said, the only way of dealing with the opposition is to control it, which is true. And that's what they do, control the opposition. That's it, you know. But anyway, I think we better wrap this up for this evening. This is going quite, you know, going very well. And I'd like to say thank you for Des and Alan for commenting in our comments section. And I've tried to put them up on the screen. And thank you very much for joining us, everybody else as well. And watch this space. We'll be here hopefully this time next week. And also, hang on, I'm just showing off this new banner idea I've got here. So here we go. Oh no, I've got the wrong one here. Here we are. I've got this. Windows on the World every Sunday. windowsontheworld.net. I didn't put .net on there. It's live every Sunday at 9 o'clock. And there's a bloke called Eric Von Essex. There's always in, I don't know, he's always in the, you know, sort of making comments on there. I don't know who he is. And
well, he's a bit of a joker, that Eric Von Essex, isn't it? Yeah,
he's always in,
he's in there every week.
You know? Yeah, I know.
I'd like to get more people in chat. We need more people in chat on there, but we get a lot of views on YouTube. The show goes out 9 o'clock every Sunday at windowsontheworld.net live, and then you can pick it up on YouTube. We prefer people to actually listen on Spreaker because our days on YouTube are probably going to be limited. We've had a lot of stuff taken down there, but you can also get us on Patreon. You can help us out on Patreon. There's going to be loads of stuff on there. And we've got a film coming up called The Heretics of London, which all viewers from Winners on the World will have privileged access to. Yeah.
Well, another thing is I'd advise viewers, please, if it's the only thing you're going to do, look at, was it the band Who Saw the Future? That one program.
The Man Who Saw the Future, yeah.
Now I thought I'd heard everything, and I'm not showing off there. You know, you hear lots of things and that, but my jaw almost hit the floor when I heard it, because it's chapter, line, verse, no conspiracies, in black and white. We don't do with conspiracy, we only do with facts. But what this chap said, I think was it in 1979 there was a conference or something?
1987,
like that?
there was the World Wilderness Congress, which was actually organized through Maurice Strong and Edmund de Rothschild. And basically what people don't understand is that two people can steer global policy, because globalists think very big, the public think very small. And yes, it was a fellow called George Hunt who happened to go to that conference, and then it followed on with Rio, the Earth Summit of '92. We tell the whole story of that, and the background of it is in that show. It's called The Man Who Saw the Future, and that was in 1987. And in 1987, George Hunt was making videos saying, if the public find out against this, they will rise up with anger and indignation against these people. I'm here to start that, so that maybe the fire is going to start amongst the public, and they are going to stop these people doing what they want. Now, no one's actually stopped it, and the implementation of that agenda is now pretty much complete. The smart cities are all ready, and the whole thing came out of documents from the Club of Rome, and it was been implemented just by a few billionaires. And the World Bank are now the World Conservation Bank. We've got the Global Environmental Facility, which is basically the land grabbing arm, and the World Bank are trustees of that. And all this came out of, yes, a couple of conferences.
Well, I think that, you know, what you were saying, I mean, about the smart cities. Now, I live in a very rural area, but it won't be rural for much longer, because they're talking about, I mean, when I was at a planning meeting, there was what I believe is a change agent, and he's supposed to be a councillor. He's supposed to be a conservative councillor at that, and he was complaining that the housing density is not enough. Now, the housing densities in London.
Well, no, he's been told that. He's been told that they're going to increase housing density. So his job is to get the public ready for more housing density and tell the public that they need it. Everything has to be done in the form of a benefit, as the way the public see it. So in other words, the public are told that they need higher housing density, and they go, oh, we need higher housing density. Well, they don't really. And councillors have told me that, housing officers have told me this, that they can't understand the density of housing. I only can understand it because I've seen the documentation. And when I explain it to them, they go, that makes sense. I do know about this stuff. It's just that they hadn't put it together as being part of this overall agenda, which is now being enforced.
Well, before we go, I'll just leave on this note. Letchworth Garden City in Hertfordshire is one of the first garden cities that was started before the First World War in the Edwardian times. And the properties were 17 dwellings per hectare. In London, it's 100 dwellings per hectare. And what this change agent, Bozo, was pushing for was 150 dwellings per hectare. Just think that one through. Thank you very much, Mark.
A lot higher than that in London, yeah.
Really? Yeah. Well, thanks for joining us, Mark, and stay tuned, because hopefully around this time next week we'll be back on air. Thank you very much for joining.
Let's make a habit of it.
Okay.
All right.
Thanks, Mark. Good night, everyone.
Cheers.